In the gentle hush of evening, as shadows lengthen and the world quiets its busy hum, we gather once more around the flickering light of imagination. Let your eyelids grow heavy, your breath slow and deep, like the rhythm of waves lapping a distant shore. Tonight we embark on a serene journey through the mists of time, exploring the soft echoes of civilizations that rose with grace, bloomed in quiet splendor, and then faded into peaceful repose. These are not tales of clamor or conquest, but whispers of lives lived in harmony with the earth, of cities built with care, and of legacies that linger like dreams half remembered upon waking. Wherever you are, whatever hour cradles you now, whether the moon hangs high or the dawn whispers softly, allow my voice to be your guide, a soothing thread weaving through the fabric of history. Relax your shoulders, let tension melt away like snow in spring, and drift with me into the past. Picture, if you will, a vast and tranquil plain in central Anatolia, where the horizon stretches endlessly under a sky painted in soft blues and golds. Here, almost 9,000 years ago, in the gentle embrace of the Neolithic Age, humanity took a peaceful step forward. People, weary from the endless wanderings of the hunt, began to settle, taming the wild grains of the steppe with tender hands, corralling goats and sheep into folds where they grazed contentedly. From this serene shift from forager to farmer rose Cataluk, a settlement so wondrous in its simplicity, so harmonious in its design, that it still invites us to ponder its calm mysteries. It began around 7,500 BCE, a modest cluster of mud brick homes rising side by side on a gentle mound above the plain, like a family huddling close for warmth on a cool evening. The people of Cataluk were farmers at heart, sowing wheat and barley in the fertile soil, gathering peas and lentils from the earth's bountiful lap, and tending herds of sheep and goats whose soft bleating echoed among the reed beds of a long-vanished river, yet their spirits remained tied to the old ways. They still ventured into the plains to hunt aurochs, those majestic wild cattle, or to draw the thrill of pursuit from wild boars in the marshes. It was this delicate balance, this quiet tension between the nomadic pulse of the hunt and the steady rhythm of agriculture that infused Cataluk with its unique character, a power born not of force, but of peaceful adaptation. Unlike the bustling cities that would come later in Mesopotamia, with their wide boulevards and towering ziggurats, Cataluk had no streets, no open paths cutting through its heart. Instead, the houses pressed together in a great honeycomb of mud and timber, each sharing walls with its neighbors, creating a woven tapestry of community. To move through the town was to ascend ladders to the flat rooftops, where one could wander from home to home under the vast Anatolian sky, the sun warming your back like a gentle hand. These rooftops were more than mere passageways. They were the thoroughfares of daily life, marketplaces where women might sit in the soft light, gossiping quietly as they pounded grain with stone mortar, their movements rhythmic and unhurried. Children chased one another between hearth smoke vents, their laughter floating lightly on the breeze, while men carried obsidian blades that gleamed like fragments of night sky, tools traded from distant volcanic lands. Inside the homes, life unfolded in small, intimate chambers, walls plastered smooth with lime and painted over and over in soothing shades of ochre and charcoal. Some bore serene images of wild hunts, where figures moved gracefully across the landscape, vultures gliding peacefully over forms at rest, or great bulls standing calmly in fields of crimson. Others were adorned with the horns and skulls of aurochs, deer or ram's trophies, not of violence, but transformed into sacred icons, reminders of the earth's quiet gifts. In these cozy rooms, the living shared space with the dead in a tender, eternal bond. Burials occurred beneath the very platforms where families slept. Generations layered gently in the soil below, their presence a soft whisper of ancestry and continuity. Children, elders, mothers, hunters all, were folded back into the home, their bones sometimes painted with care, or their skulls exhumed and replastered, as if to invite them once more into the warm circle of the living. A cycle as natural as the turning of days into nights. Cataluk was not a city ruled by kings or dominated by grand monuments. There were no palaces casting long shadows, no temples soaring above the rooftops to demand awe. Instead, it was a place of equals, or so the earth tells us in its subtle ways. a society bound by shared beliefs, gentle rituals, and the close-knit demands of survival. Each household was its own serene center, producing food from the land, crafting tools with steady hands, burying the departed with quiet reverence. While the archaeological traces reveal little hierarchy, no districts of lavish mansions, no signs of lords commanding the labor of peasants. Rather, the town drew its strength from community, from the hearths that glowed softly red within each home, warming bodies and spirits alike, and from ceremonies that united them in times of feast and quiet reflection during famine. This was a town of artists and artisans, where hands molded figurines of corpulent goddesses, symbols perhaps of fertility or protectors of the hearth, their forms rounded and comforting. They carved obsidian into daggers, so sharp they cut with effortless grace, weaving textiles from wool and plant fibers so fine that their impressions linger on clay even now, like faint memories preserved in time. The earth beneath Cataluyuk held volcanic glass in abundance, this dark obsidian becoming their bridge to a wider world. Traded across Anatolia for shells from distant seas or stones from far mountains. In this way, Cataluyuk became not just a settlement, but a hub of gentle exchange where ideas and objects pass softly, leaving traces that echo across millennia, inviting us to imagine the quiet conversations around fires. The sharing of knowledge, like a warm blanket, passed from one to another. As the centuries drifted by like leaves on a slow-moving stream, the settlement swelled to perhaps 5,000 souls. Or even Mara, astonishing gathering in the Neolithic world, where nowhere else in Europe or Asia did so many dwell under one sky. From afar, Cataluyuk would have appeared as a great mound, its rooftops a mosaic of activity, fires flickering like stars against the night. To live there was to be part of something new and fragile, a human hive where daily life was dense yet intimate, communal yet personal. It was one of the world's first experiments in urban living, blueprint whose soft echoes can be felt in the crowded alleys and stacked dwellings of cities today, though softened by time's gentle hand. And yet, despite all this closeness, Cataluyuk was not a place of anonymity. Every hearth told its own story. Every wall painting held the memory of a family's devotion. Every burial beneath the floor tied the living to their ancestors in a bond as tender as a lullaby. It was a world where the sacred and the ordinary intertwined seamlessly. A loaf of bread was both sustenance and offering. A hunt both survival and ritual, rising each morning a quiet affirmation of life in the company of the departed, and dying a peaceful return to their embrace. This was Cataluyuk in its rise, neither kingdom nor empire, but a crucible of human ingenuity and imagination, where from mud and plaster emerged new ways of living that rippled outward like calm waves on a pond. For nearly 2 millennia, it endured, a testament to what humans could build when they came together in trust, faith, and necessity. Until the landscape began to change, rivers shifting their courses, and the mound was left to rest, its people drifting to new horizons. The site slumbering under layers of earth, dreaming of rooftops under the sun. By the 7th millennium before the Common Era, Cataluyuk had grown into a settlement unparalleled in its quiet majesty. Where once there had been a scattering of huts upon the Kanya plain, there now stood a sprawling mound that glowed with hearth smoke and the murmur of thousands. A population density so great that by the measures of the ancient world, it was a wonder of harmony. At its height, between 5,000 and 8,000 souls lived pressed close within those mud brick walls. Yet in peace, a hive upon the earth, dense and living. Its flat roofs rose tear upon tear, walls shining white where plaster caught the sun's soft light. Life was lived upon those rooftops. But there were no streets as we know them, only this elevated world of passage and encounter, where one traveled from neighbor to neighbor under the open sky. To descend into a house was to step into a chambered cave of humanity's earliest urban dream, each home small but carefully kept. Walls smoothed and painted with lime plaster, floors renewed again and again as generations passed in gentle succession. In the corner, a clay oven glowed red, its smoke venting through the roof hole like a sigh, while against the wall lay bins of barley and emmer, lentils and peas, precious stores that sustained through winter's quiet chill. Everywhere the scent of grain dust and baked bread mingled with the sharper aroma of hides and wool, a comforting bouquet that wrapped the inhabitants like a warm embrace. The houses of Cataluk were not merely dwellings. They were shrines to life's continuity. Walls bearing vivid paintings of hunters chasing deer in graceful motion, vultures hovering over human forms in restful poses, geometric designs whose meanings drift to us like half-forgotten songs, filled with power and peace. Many homes displayed bullhorns and skulls embedded in their walls, painted and replastered over centuries until they gleamed like pale bone rising from red earth. Such trophies of the wild were not symbols of triumph, but reminders of awe, of the pact between humans and the beasts that roam the steppe beyond the fields, a quiet respect for the balance of nature. Death, too, lived in the house in a tender way. The people buried their dead beneath the platforms where they ate, worked, and slept. Bodies wrapped and interred with small gifts, sometimes painted with ochre and loving strokes. The bones of ancestors mingled with the foundations of family life, and in some cases, skulls were later exhumed, plastered with new faces, and returned to the household. As if the living could not bear to let the departed fade entirely into silence, keeping them close in a cycle as natural as breathing. The house itself became a lineage, a container of generations, a bridge between past and present, where the whispers of the gone before lingered like a soft lullaby in the night. For nearly 15 centuries, the people of Cataluk endured upon the Kanya plain, raising their children above the bones of their ancestors, plastering their walls again and again with red ochre, and climbing each morning onto the rooftops to begin another day in the great honeycomb of homes. Yet even the most enduring harmony has its limits, and around the 6th millennium before the Common Era, signs of strain began to appear. Subtle at first, like the first cool breeze of autumn, the landscape that had nurtured Cataluk so faithfully began to change thee. Marshlands and floodplains that had provided water and fertile silt slowly dried as the regional climate shifted, rivers altering their courses, leaving the inhabitants with less reliable flooding for their crops. Farming, which had once been a gentle dance with the earth, became more challenging on this shifting land, and easier in outlying regions where smaller groups could cultivate without the dense communal demands. Families, seeking better soil and more space, moved outward into the countryside, founding quieter villages beyond the crowded mound, their footsteps fading softly into the distance. Within the settlement, traces of inequality crept in, like shadows lengthening at dusk. Archaeologists have uncovered houses larger than their neighbors, filled with finer goods and exotic materials that hint at privilege, obsidian from distant sources, rare shells, and intricately crafted ornaments appearing in some homes, while others held only the necessities of survival. The pattern is subtle but telling. Over time, wealth and power may have gathered in the hands of a few households, setting the balance that had long kept Cataluk in peaceful cohesion. The settlement itself grew increasingly difficult to maintain, with no streets to separate houses. Every new building was raised upon the ruins of the old, pressing the mound higher into the sky, creating a labyrinth of unstable foundations where collapsed walls and buried debris had to be constantly managed. Fires, accidents, and disease would have spread easily in such tightly packed quarters, though life continued in its quiet way, living cheek by jowl with thousands of others, sharing not only rooftops, but also the bones of generations buried beneath the floors. Must have bred tension at times. The close communal life that had been Cataluk's strength becoming its greatest burden as the years wore on. Long before the first stones of Athens were laid, long before the pharaohs raised their pyramids upon the sands, another civilization emerged upon the floodplains of South Asia, between the Indus and the Sarasvati, in the lands that now stretch across Pakistan and northwestern India. Here, sometime around 2600 before the Common Era, the Indus Valley civilization took form, a world of serene order and gentle abundance. The heart of this world was its geography. The Indus River and its tributaries brought not only water, but the silts that made the land rich. Summer monsoons sweeping in from the Indian Ocean, filling reservoirs and flooding the earth with life in a rhythmic cycle. Crops of wheat and barley thrived in the fields alongside sesame and peas. Pastures supported cattle, sheep, and goats, while nearby marshes and riverbanks yielded fish, turtles, and wildfowl, all in a peaceful harmony with the land. The abundance made settlement possible, but it was ingenuity that transformed villages into cities, carefully designed spaces where life flowed as smoothly as the rivers themselves. By the middle of the third millennium, great urban centers had risen. Harappa in the north, and Mohenjo-Daro further south, along the Indus, were the largest. But dozens of others dotted the plain. From Lothal near the Arabian Sea to Dholavira upon the island of Kutch, these were not haphazard towns, but places of deliberate planning, streets laid out in straight lines, crossing at right angles, forming a grid that spoke of calm organization. Houses of baked bricks stood 2 or 3 stories tall, their walls strong against the rains. Some opening onto courtyards where families rested in the shade, others with staircases climbing to rooftops for the evening breeze. From above, the cities of the Indus looked like ordered labyrinths, each quarter bound together by uniformity and care, a soothing pattern that invited peace. What marked these settlements most of all was their attention to water in Mohenjo-Daro. Wells lined with brick offered sweet water to nearly every household. Drainage channels ran beneath the streets, carrying waste away with quiet efficiency, covered with fitted stone slabs. In some neighborhoods, public baths rose above the city blocks, the most famous being the Great Bath of Mohenjo-Daro. A tank lined with bitumen to keep it watertight, steps descending from either end. A place not merely for cleansing, but for ritual. A communal center where water carried spiritual as well as physical meaning. Its surface still and reflective like a meditative pool. The people of the Indus Valley were not ruled by kings whose likenesses were carved upon monuments, nor by generals who left behind tales of conquest. No towering ziggurats or colossal statues dominate their ruins. Instead, their legacy lies in uniformity and order, bricks fired to the same proportions from one end of the civilization to the other, suggesting a shared system and perhaps a shared authority that held without spectacle, a gentle governance. Seals carved from steatite, inscribed with symbols that remain undeciphered, were pressed into clay and carried in trade. Small emblems of identity and administration. Their script a mystery that whispers of quiet record-keeping. This was a civilization of artisans and merchants. Beads of carnelian, agate, and faience, found in great number. Drilled with astonishing precision, pottery decorated with black designs of animals and plants, fired to a fine finish. The cities were not isolated, but connected by roads and rivers. Their goods carried as far as Mesopotamia, where Indus beads had been uncovered in Sumerian cities. In return came silver, tin, and perhaps the stories of distant peoples. The docks at Lothal, with their great brick basin, suggest ships and sea trade carrying the wealth of the Indus across the Arabian Sea, a peaceful exchange that linked worlds, though their names are lost to us. The people of the Indus Valley lived lives that once ordinary and profound. Children played with terracotta toys. Farmers tended their fields as the monsoon clouds rolled overhead in soft procession. Women adorned themselves with bangles and beads. Men wore amulets and seals. In courtyards, meals of grain and lentils were prepared with care, and in workshops, beads and tools were shaped by skilled hands. The air filled with the soft sounds of creation, the world was one of quiet prosperity. Built upon careful planning, abundant harvests, and a balance between humanity and the river's power. Here upon the floodplains of the Indus, one of the world's first great urban civilizations took root, not in the shadow of kings, but in the careful order of streets and drains, in the rhythm of agriculture and trade. It was a society that found strength not in monuments of power, but in the fabric of daily life, woven across cities that endured for centuries, a serene tapestry of existence. No monuments to kings dominate the skyline. No triumphal inscriptions tell of campaigns and captured prisoners. Authority hid itself in systems. It lived in brick dimensions and in the width of a lane, and in the seal a merchant pressed into clay before his goods began their journey. That journey extended far beyond the river plain. The docks at Lothal enclosed a brick-lined basin, connected to tidal water by a channel cut with care. Whether every scholar agrees on its exact use is less important than the truth it embodies. The hairpins built for the sea. Boats with high prows plied the Indus and its delta channels. Along coastal routes and across open water, they sailed to Oman and the Gulf. In Mesopotamia, scribes wrote of a distant land called Meluha, whose merchants came to their ports with beads and woods and perhaps cotton textiles. Indus seals have been found in Sumerian cities. Cylinder seals from the west reached Harappan homes. Copper from the hills and tin from far mountains came into the Indus realm and left again transformed by skilled hands. Religion and rule left subtler marks. On white steatite seals, the engravers carved images that repeated across the centuries. A long-horned creature that scholars call the unicorn stands before a ritual stand. A bull lowers its head in power. A man sits cross-legged with heels together and arms on knees surrounded by wild animals. A lord of beasts whom some see as an ancestor of later deities. Tiny clay figurines of women with elaborate headdresses appear in household shrines. Fire altars stood in courtyards at Calibangan. Great bath at Mohenjo-Daro suggests the importance of ritual purity and communal rite. Yet there are few weapons and graves, and few signs of violent conquest. Whatever the Harappans believed, it did not demand colossal temples or boastful reliefs. Their piety rested in water, and in the measured act repeated in a seal pressed into soft clay. In a bath stepped into with clean feet, a quiet devotion that brought serenity to the soul. Daily life in this high age had a quiet rhythm that is almost audible, still in the early light. A woman drew water from a well set in the corner of her courtyard and poured it over a plastered floor that she had swept smooth. A potter lifted a vessel from a kiln and listened for the clear ring that meant the firing took. Well, children chased one another along the edge of a lane and hopped over stone-set covers that hid a running drain. A scribe or merchant pressed his seal into a lump of clay on a jar lid, the tiny signs and sacred animal fixing ownership and destination. In the evening, men sat on the flat roofs and watched the last glow fade over the river, while the breeze moved between the blocks of the city and cooled the brick by every measure that matters in the life of a city. The Indus world had reached a rare balance. Its towns were clean and carefully serviced. Its craftsmen were expert and its merchants trusted. Its farmers drew steady harvests from retentive soils and predictable floods. Its rulers, whoever they were, kept order without leaving grand claims in stone. The civilization learned to be strong by being regular and wide, rather than by being spectacular and narrow. In that quiet strength, it rivaled the great kingdoms to its west and endured for centuries on the strength of rivers and rules. By the closing centuries of the third millennium before the Common Era, the rhythm that had sustained the cities of the Indus began to falter. The signs show first as quiet changes in brick and street and storehouse. In Mohenjo-Daro, some lanes filled with silt and were never fully cleared. Drains that once carried wastewater under stone covers clogged and were patched with hurried work. Large rooms and houses were subdivided into smaller chambers. Kilns that had fired bricks to a uniform measure went cold in some quarters, and builders lifted old bricks from abandoned walls to reuse them elsewhere. In Harappa, the careful order of granary platforms and administrative halls gave way to a patchwork of new constructions raised with less precision. At Dolavira, the great reservoir still held water, but the city on its island of salt and stone began to empty, its gateways quiet, its step tanks no longer busy with the footfall of thousands. The landscape itself was changing. The summer monsoon that for centuries had breathed life into the floodplains weakened by slow degrees. Lakes and riverbeds across the northwest record years of lower water and longer dry seasons. The Gagar-Hakra system that many identify with the ancient Sarasvati dwindled as the Sutlej and the Yamuna shifted their allegiance toward other basins, where broad channels had once run bank to bank with silty water. Lesser streams wandered over gravel and sand. Farmers whose fathers had sown wheat and barley on flood-enriched fields faced erratic yields. Some seasons the river rose late or not at all. Other seasons violent water tore at bundas and washed seed from the soil. The delicate balance that had made urban life possible grew uncertain. Trade frayed at the edges. Far to the west, the cities of southern Mesopotamia suffered their own upheavals, and the old exchange of goods and seals and stories across sea and desert fell into interruption. References to Meluha fade from scribal tablets, and the Indus town's workshops still turned out fine goods. But the reach of their markets narrowed, the docks at Lothal silted. Boats still moved along the lower river and out to the creeks, yet fewer foreign tokens found their way back to Harappan homes, with less distant exchange to knit the realm together. Each city and region turned inward to its own needs. Within the towns, the markers of a shared system loosened. Weights once cut to exact values show greater variation in the final centuries of city life. Seals of steatite become fewer. In some districts, the famous brick ratio that had given walls their reliable strength was abandoned for expedients that met the moment. The old regularity yielded to improvisation. None of this came in a single season. It unfolded across generations as builders chose repair over renewal, and as officials, whoever they were, could no longer sustain the labor and oversight that once kept streets clean and drains flowing. At Mohenjo-Daro, the river's power left its own signature. Archaeologists uncovered repeated layers of water-laid silt across parts of the lower town. After each inundation, the citizens raised floor levels and thresholds to keep pace, but the struggle grew harder. In time, people abandoned the lowest quarters rather than lift them yet again. The Great Bath still held its stony dignity, but its galleries and stairways cracked, and the bitumen that once sealed its floor dried and pulled at the joints. In Harappa, cemeteries reveal a different kind of stress. Skeletons from later strata show more signs of disease and injury than those from earlier centuries. Tuberculosis and leprosy left marks on bone. Blunt force trauma appears in a small number of skulls. These are not the traces of a single day of conquest, but the toll of long hardship felt in bodies. As the rivers changed and the urban systems grew brittle, people moved, the pattern of occupation across the northwest. Tells of a slow outward drift from the great mounds towards smaller settlements spread more widely on the land. The Punjab and the upper Ganges basin drew many with the promise of more reliable summer rain. In the old heartland, urban life yielded to village life. The late Harappan cultures of Sindh and Punjab and Saurashtra kept much of the material inheritance of earlier centuries, while living at a gentler scale. Pottery shapes evolved and painted designs shifted. In Punjab, the cemetery culture that scholars label Cemetery H shows new mortuary customs and a taste for painted urns. In Sindh, the Jukar tradition carried forward elements of Harappan craft under reduced circumstances. Along the Saurashtra coast, the Sarath communities held on to a maritime life with fewer towns and more hamlets. The script that once marked seals and tablets fell out of use. Public works were no longer maintained to the standard that once astonished later ages. The people did not disappear. They planted and grazed and traded and raised children. Now in hundreds of villages where once they had lived in dozens of cities. Older tales once spoke of invading hosts toppling the cities by violence. The ground tells a quieter and more complex story. There is little ash of conquest in Harappa or Mohenjo-Daro that matches a single fatal sack. Instead, there is flood and drought and river avulsion, a thinning of trade. A dispersal of people to where rains were better and fields more forgiving. Newcomers surely arrived over time, as newcomers always do along open plains, bringing languages and customs that met those of the old inhabitants. The end of the Indus cities was not a night of fire, but a long twilight in which households chose departure rather than struggle or were compelled by hunger to seek new ground. Picture Mohenjo-Daro in its last inhabited generation. In the lower town, a lane runs between brick walls that once stood 2 stories tall. Some doorways are bricked up. A well at a corner still yields water, but its curb is worn. And the steps that drop to the bathing floor are uneven with patches. On a roof, a family cooks over a small hearth, while the sun lowers over the river. They speak of a cousin who left for a farming village near the Doab, where the monsoon is kinder. A beadmaker still drills carnelian in a workshop, but sells more to neighbors and fewer to traveling traders. In the night, a warm wind moves through the empty rooms of a house across the lane, a house whose owners left seasons ago. In the morning, a cart creaks out of the lane, piled with jars and bedding and a rolled mat bound for a smaller settlement of Priver. By about 1800 before the Common Era, the great cities were shadows of themselves. A century or two later, many of the mounds lay silent. Bricks slipped and tumbled. Vines found roots in cracked mortar. Dust settled on thresholds that no longer felt the press of feet. The civilization that had mastered water and measurement, and the quiet governance of streets, had unraveled into a different way of life. Its gifts endured farming methods, craft skills, and the habit of ordered work passed to the communities that followed. Far to the east, centuries later, new towns would rise on the Ganges plain with their own forms and faiths. But if you look closely, you can see in them the long memory of measured brick and planned street learned beside the Indus. Crete lies like a long green ship in the middle sea, lashed by winter winds and blessed by long summers. Its spine a chain of mountains whose snows feed springs that tumble down to plains of grain and groves that smell of resin and time. On this island between three continents, far enough from mainland strife to grow in its own manner, yet close enough to every coast to gather ideas like shells from many shores, Europe's first great civilization took root. The earliest farmers were already here in the 7th millennium before the Common Era, tending emmer and barley and keeping sheep and goats on terraces cut into the hills. By the 3rd millennium before the Common Era, with copper tools in their hands, and boats stout enough to follow the island chain of the Cyclades, the people of Crete began to weave together a culture that would rise into palaces and courtyards and store. Rooms deep with jars of oil and wine, geography shaped everything. The broad Masara plain in the south, open to warm winds off the Libyan Sea, yielded heavy harvests and favored the growth of olives and vines. The north coast offered anchorages like Amnisos that opened the way to the Aegean, while the east presented sheltered coves near Zakros that looked toward Cyprus and the Levant. Thick stands of cypress and pine gave strong timbers for ships and roofs. Mountain passes led to high sanctuaries, where the people set small altars on windy peaks and watched the clouds move like caravans across the sky. The sea was not a barrier, but a road, and the Cretans learned its moods until hull and wave seemed to share a single pulse. By the early 2nd millennium before the Common Era, a transformation was underway. Villages grew into large towns and then into court-centered complexes that later ages would call palaces, though they were more than royal houses. At Knossos in the north, at Phaistos above the Mazara plain, at Malea near a fertile coastal strip, and at Zakros in the east, builders laid out compounds around great paved courts. These places gathered grain oil, wine wool, timber, and crafted goods from the countryside, and sent them out again, across the island and over the sea. Long parallel magazines lined with stone bases held ranks of pithoi that could store the surplus of many harvests. Corridors turned and opened into light wells where sun and air fell down into inner rooms. Stairways climbed to upper stories where officials counted and recorded shipments with seal stones and clay nodules. On some tablets appears a native script that scholars call hieroglyphic, soon followed by another script known as linear A. The language behind these signs remains unread, but the script itself tells us of an administration that needed writing to keep order in the flow of goods and obligations. The people of Crete did not ring these centers with massive walls. Their confidence rested in the sea, and in the ships that patrolled the waters between islands, and perhaps in the ties of exchange that bound neighbors to them. Roads of packed stone-linked palace and village. Near each center lay a town of workshops where potters fired thin-walled cups painted in lively bands of red and white on black, a style known by its fine place near the slopes of Mount Ida. Bronze workers hammered blades and chisels, whose edges gleam still. Seal cutters turned soft stone into tiny masterpieces, where lions prance and bulls lower their heads, and spirals uncoil like waves. Household shrines held small figures of women with bright belts and flounced skirts, who lift serpents in their hands while horns set upon terraces, and the sign of the double axe carved in stone mark a sacred imagery that repeats from one end of the island to the other. Religion breathed through mountaintop sanctuaries and caves deep in limestone hearts. On peaks like Juctus above Knossos and Petsaphos in the east, worshippers left clay figurines of men with arms raised and women with long skirts, along with miniature vessels, models of animals, as if bringing the whole island in small to the place where sky and earth meet. In caves like Camaris on the slopes of Ida, generations offered bronze blades and pins and plaques in dark chambers where water dripped and the air was cool even in high summer. The sacred lived in high places and in the earth's deep places, and it lived also in the central courts where processions could unfold before many eyes, a ceremonial stage set by architects who understood light and wind. Trade bound Crete to every compass point. From the islands came fine emery for polishing and marble for vessels. From Cyprus and the Anatolian coast came copper by ingot and or to feed the furnaces that turned a stony island into a bronze-working power. From Egypt came faience and carved hippopotamus ivory and images of water, birds, and lotus that Minoan painters adapted to their own taste. From the Levant came cedar and blue glass and perhaps scribal practices. In return, the ships of Crete carried timber, oil, wine wool and textiles, honey, and exquisite crafted goods that traveled with the seals that marked their origin. The iconography of Cretan art appears in far harbors, and Egyptian tomb paintings show people of the islands bringing gifts to the courts of pharaohs, their skin painted a reddish brown, their garments bright, their gifts heavy with scent. Within the island, wealth and skill concentrated in the court centers, but the countryside remained the foundation. Farmsteads dotted the plains and the lower slopes. Terraces stitched the hillsides to keep soil from running with the winter rains. Press rooms with grooved stone slabs and circular basins speak to the serious business of oil and wine production. Shepherds drove flocks along ancient tracks and brought wool to workshops, where spinners and weavers turned it into cloth fine enough to glitter with tiny beads of faience. The rhythm of sowing and harvest continued without break, and with each season, the magazines filled the pithoi, sealed with fresh clay. The seals pressed with symbols whose meanings are lost, but whose authority remains visible in the smooth oval of a seal print. Sometime in the middle of the second millennium, before the Common Era, the island felt the earth shake with special fury. Archaeological layers at several sites show a horizon of destruction that ended the first generation of palaces. Walls cracked and fell, storerooms burned. Yet the end of one phase became the beginning of another. In the generations that followed, the Cretans rebuilt on a larger plan, courts grew broader corridors, more intricate storerooms. Longer and more numerous light wells multiplied. Staircases carried traffic to higher floors, where rooms opened to porticos with columns painted deep red and black. Fresco. Painters covered plaster with scenes of lilies and dolphins, and people in ceremonial dress moving in ordered file. Administrative habits expanded with the spread of linear A. The island entered a new energy that would carry it to its greatest reach. What emerges from this long rise is a picture of a society that learned how to gather and store surplus, how to manage movement of goods and people, how to dress ritual in an architecture of courts and terraces and light-filled rooms, and how to place itself at the center of seaways that tied the Aegean to the shores of Egypt and the Levant. The Minoans became masters of an island by turning its mountains, plains, forests, and harbors into a single system with courts as its hearts. The strength of Crete in this age did not rest on walls, but on knowledge of wind and current on ships that knew every channel on the measured flow of oil and grain and wine, and on the shared signs that sealed a jar or recorded a delivery. In this, the island fashioned a civilization whose grace and order astonish even now, when only stones and fragments remain. By the middle of the second millennium before the Common Era, Crete stood at the center of the Aegean like a lordly ship with many oars. Its harbors crowded with masts, and its courts loud with the footfall of scribes and stewards. The palaces were the hearts that drove this island body. The Sauce in the north unfurled around a great central court paved in white and buff slabs, with long rows of magazines, where pithoi as tall as a man stood waiting for oil and grain and wine. Stairways of dressed gypsum rose beside light wells that dropped cool air into the building's inner rooms. Pier and door partitions opened whole suites so that sun and breeze could pass, and then close them again when ceremony demanded privacy. Water ran through terracotta conduits set beneath floors. At Knossos there were stone basins for bathing, and even a lavatory with a seat worn by use, a small touch of luxury that speaks of a court used to comfort. Bastos on the southern plain answered with its own terraces and a flight of steps that formed a gathering place like a small theater. Malea held magazines lined with stone bases where jars once stood in ranks. Zakros looked eastward across a rocky shore, its storerooms and reception halls fed by ships that came from Cyprus and the Levant. Around these centers spread towns of many-storied houses, with painted rooms and wells, and beyond them, fields and terraces and olive groves that fed the magazines year by year. Administration gave rhythm to abundance. The island adopted writing for keeping accounts and sealing transactions. Clay nodules and tablets incised in linear A recorded allocations of grain and oil and wool, the quantities marked by signs that recur from one end of Crete to the other. Ceilings carry images of lions and bulls and ships, and sacred emblems pressed into damp clay to bind a jar or close a door. Weights of stone and bronze show a standard system, so that measure and reckoning held. When true, whether one traded in the workshops near Knossos, or at the harbor of Komos that served Phaistos. Villas in the countryside repeated the methods of the palaces on a smaller scale. They sat at road junctions and near press rooms with their own magazines and shrines and acted as relay points for produce and as local seats of authority that tied village and field to palace court. The island was not a scatter of towns, but a network its strands counted and sealed. Religion colored public life in ways that even the fallen. Plaster still reveals on walls at Nassis's blue dolphins swim above a room, whose floors once shone with gypsum in another chamber, a throne of carved stone. Sits against a wall painted with griffins that watch in stillness, while a basin lies set in the floor where water would have reflected torchlight. On hilltops like Juctus near Knossos, Petsophis, above Palacastro, the winds still scour small platforms where worshippers left offerings of clay and bronze. In caves such as Camers on Mount Ida, votive blades and pins and figurines speak of centuries of devotion. In the central courts, the island staged processions and games that drew crowds to watch youths and maidens move with ritual grace. The bull was the most potent image horns of consecration crown walls. In terraces, frescoes show acrobats gripping a charging bull by the horns and vaulting over the animal. It's back a spectacle equal parts danger and display. An assertion that human skill could master raw force for a moment before letting it run free. Trade carried the fame of Crete far beyond its shores. Egyptian tomb paintings of the 18th dynasty show men from the islands bringing gifts to Thebes labeled by scribes as people of Keftiu. They carry silver vessels and painted cups and ingots and strange objects whose beauty mattered more than their names. Minoan-style frescoes decorated halls at the delta site of Avaris, proof that Cretan painters or their students worked at foreign courts. To the North Islanders of Thera painted their town with lilies and swallows and ships until the sea breeze seemed to move along the walls. At Miletus on the Anatolian coast, and at Keftia south of the Peloponnese, Cretan crafts and habits took root. How laid the ships of Crete were trim and long with high curling prows. They moved along the Cycladic chain and out across open water to Cyprus and to ports of Syria and Canaan. Timber, oil, wine, wool, honey, and saffron left the island. Copper, ivory, gold leaf, blue glass, and stones for seal cutting came in return. Maritime power in this age did not always announce itself with bronze rams and rows of captured shields. Sometimes it is better measured in safe harbors kept orderly, in customs duties collected without quarrel, and in the ability of a convoy to arrive in season year after year. Politics on Crete did not carve itself unsteely with long proclamations, yet it left clear traces in building and in reach. Knossos appears to have eclipsed its rivals during the later part of the Neopalatial era. The scale of its magazines and the spread of its seals point to a centralization stronger than before. Country villas aligned with Notion interests, the central and eastern landscape. Road systems converge on the capital. The absence of great fortifications at palaces suggests that control was exercised, through fleets and through the web of exchange and obligation rather than through garrisons behind walls. Even so, power never goes uncontested for long. On the mainland to the north, the Mycenaean princes grew rich behind the Cyclopean walls of Mycenae, Tyrans, and Pylos. Their grave circles yielded daggers inlaid with gold and silver, images of lion hunts and sea battles. Their scribes would later write an early form of Greek on clay tablets. In Linear B, these lords traded with Crete and learned from it. But they also coveted and competed in Aegean politics. A friend today could be a rival tomorrow when a storm, an earthquake, or an empty grain store overturned the balance of favor. War and diplomacy left faint but telling signs in the island record. The harbor town of Kydonia on Crete-esque northwestern coast shows evidence of contact with the mainland that would later become domination. At Naissus, after the middle of the 15th century before the Common Era, the administrative tablets are no longer in Linear A, but in Linear B, which speaks of Greek speech and Mycenaean control. Before that turning, in the bright height of Minoan confidence, Cretan craftsmen and officials likely managed a league of allied towns and outposts, each bound to court centers by roads, shrines, and accounting. Enemies beyond the sea knew the cost of challenging such a system. Pirates might try a raid on a soft shore, but the island's fleets and watchful harbors answered. When diplomacy suited better than force, gifts, marriages, and mutual trade concessions kept the sea lanes smooth. Crete held its position, through a mixture of abundance, agility, and the prestige of a culture that others wish to share. The arts reached a finesse that still startles. In the century before the fall, the potters perfected what scholars call the marine style. Octopuses stretched their tentacles across rounded jars, their eyes bright, their bodies wrapped around the curve of clay, as if clinging to the very sea. Argonauts, dolphins, and seagrass flow across cups and craters, with a confidence that could only come from people who lived by tides and current. Jewelers at Malea created a gold pendant in the form of two bees clasping a drop of honey, a piece so delicate that every leg and wing preserves a sense of life. Sword makers set hilts with rock crystal and carnelian. Seal cutters carve stones so small that they disappear in the palm, yet when pressed in clay, they show hunters' altars, and ships with a clarity that rivals later gem carving. The courts of Crete were not only storehouses, they were schools of taste that set fashions from the Nile to the Anatolian shore. Daily life under this high order was practical and layered with ceremony. In the towns around the palaces, houses rose in blocks of ashlar and rubble. Their ground floors were used for storage and craft, their upper rooms for living and receiving. Wells stood in courtyards. Streets were paved where traffic was heavy. Workshops for pottery and bronze lay in their own quarters, so that smoke and hammering did not disturb the processions that crossed the west courts. Farmers on the Masara plowed small fields behind oxen and hauled baskets of olives to presses where stone basins wait still. Shepherds moved flocks along marked paths and brought fleeces to fullers and spinners. When news came that a fleet had reached harbor, officials opened storerooms and measured out cargoes while scribes marked tablets and stamped them with cylinder seals. On festival days, the palace courts filled with color and sound. Musicians beat frame drums and blew on reed pipes. Dancers in flounced skirts and belts moved in figures before the raised stands while elders and guests watched from steps that flanked the courts like small theaters. Thus looked the power of Crete when fortune favored it. A chain of palace centers linked by roads and shrines. A countryside worked to a steady yield, a set of scripts and measures that kept accounts clear. A religion that bound communities through shared rites and emblems. A fleet that made the island master of seaways rather than a prisoner of them. And a diplomacy that stretched from Egypt to the Levant and the Anatolian coast. Its enemies were distance, an earthquake, and the rising ambition of neighbors. Its allies were order and skill, and the sea that bore its ships outward and brought wealth home again. The island that had trusted to ships in surplus learned that the earth and sea could be enemies as well as roads. Crete lies along a rim of fire where the Hellenic arc grinds and heaves, and more than once the palaces felt that power. The first great court centers ended their early life in a horizon of fallen walls around 1700, before the Common Era. An earthquake season that cracked magazines and toppled stair towers. People rebuilt with grander plans and deeper storerooms. Proof of resilience rather than weakness. Yet the lesson stood. Stone alone cannot bind fortune. North of Crete, a volcano rose from the water like a sleeping beast. When it woke, the world changed. On Thera, the town at Akrotiri was sealed under ash and pumice that fell in drifts as deep as a house, preserving streets and frescoes and jars as if a curtain had dropped in a single hour. Tree rings from far mountains and ice cores from northern ice fields mark the years around 1600 before the Common Era as a time of great eruption, though scholars still argue over the exact year. What matters for Crete is not only ash, but water. Along the north and east coasts of the island at places like Palakastro and Amnisos, sediments show marine sand and smashed pottery and splintered wood thrown inland, a signature of waves that raced south after the mountain tore itself open. Coastal works were wrecked, shoreline farms salted, harbors choked with pumice that floated for months on the Aegean. Ashfall on Crete itself was uneven and not deep, but the blow to shipping and to coastal settlements was real. For a society whose lifeblood moved by sea, disrupted harbors and dead fish could starve accounts as surely as an enemy fleet at anchor. Yet the island did not fall at once. In the years after the eruption, the courts still filled with processions. Painters still laid lilies and dolphins on wet plaster. Seal cutters still pressed their sacred emblems into clay. The palaces that had been rebuilt after the earlier earthquake season continued to rule their networks through magazines and villas and shrines. But beyond the horizon, the mainland princes gathered strength in the Argaelid and Messenia, behind walls of massive stone. Messenian lords counted their own storehouses and sent their ships along the same seaways. They learned Cretan forms, then pushed their own on the island. Art that had looked to Knossos ceased and did not resume. On the Nile Delta, the wall paintings done in Cretan manner came to an end. The balance that had favored Crete began to tilt. Then came fire in many places at once, across the island in what scholars call the late Minoan IB period. Sanctuaries went dark, magazines burned, towns were sacked. Palicastro in the east shows layers of collapse and char and smashed cult images. Zakros at the far end of the island was destroyed and abandoned. Maklos and Gornia and country villas across central and eastern Crete showed the same bitter signs. This was not the work of a single earthquake or of a stray blaze in a crowded quarter. Cult rooms are singled out for smashing, palatial buildings are targeted. The pattern of destruction is too selective and too widespread to be accident. Whether by invasion, by internal revolt, or by both, power changed hands on Crete. Knossos alone escaped that particular firestorm. In the quiet that followed, the administration there changed its tongue. The clay tablets from its storerooms shift from linear A to linear B, and the language behind the signs is Greek. The tablets list rations for workers and herds, inventories of perfumed oil, records of chariot fittings and bronze allotments, all in the style of mainland archives. Burial customs change as well. Chamber tombs appear in numbers near Armeni, filled with swords, bronze bowls, and the teeth of boars' tusk helmets. Gear of warriors of the mainland style. Pottery fashions turn toward motifs and shapes that first appear in Messenian halls. At Chania on the western coast, which the ancients knew as Kydonia, a Mycenaean administrative complex rises. And the town grows in rank as a center of power that answers no longer to Knossos. The old Cretan order has been replaced by a new regime that values the island for its resources. Its strategic harbors and the prestige of its palaces now repurposed for a different court. The political map that follows is one of Mycenaean strongholds on Cretan soil. Knossos administers much of central and eastern Crete for a time, as the linear B tablets show with lists of districts and deliveries. Kydonia rises as a western capital with its own mainland links. The countryside is reorganized to feed these new courts. Villas that once served as Cretan relay stations are rebuilt or abandoned. Some sanctuaries are restored in modest form, but many old cult practices fade, and new rites tied to mainland customs take their place. The fleets that tie Crete to Cyprus and to the Levant still sail, yet the tone of exchange has shifted. Mainland palaces now dominate the Aegean sea roads, and Cretan craft serves their fashions. Even this second life did not endure. Around the 14th century, before the Common Era, Knossos itself went up in flames. Its archives baked hard in the heat that destroyed the rooms where they lay. The palace never returned to its earlier reach. Power fragmented into regional centers, with western Kydonia remaining a seat of strength, while eastern towns shrank or turned inward. Population thinned in highland districts. Workshops simplified their output. Fresco programs grew rare and small. The island that had once set the rhythm for the Aegean now followed the lead of others, and then began to drop out of the orchestra entirely. The last act came when the whole eastern Mediterranean trembled in the years around. 1200 before the Common Era, palaces fell from Anatolia to the Peloponnese. Trade routes broke, populations moved, and fortresses burned from coast to coast. Crete shared that fate. Mycenaean centers on the island were abandoned or reduced to small hilltop communities that looked to their own survival rather than to distant markets. Iron appears in small amounts. Pottery styles lose the exuberant marine life of earlier centuries and settle into simpler forms. The old scripts vanish from use. In later tradition, Greek storytellers would speak of Dorian coming down into the islands. But the archaeology shows a drawn-out contraction rather than a single conquering rush. By the dawn of the first millennium before the Common Era, the island had entered a leaner age of villages and sanctuaries on peaks, far removed from the courts where Pithway once stood row on row. What political lesson lies in this unmaking is as plain as any carved in stone. The Minoan system could survive earthquake and even the ash of a volcano, for it rebuilt from within. It could not survive a coordinated assault on its sacred and administrative hearts at many sites, or the arrival of neighbors who controlled the same seas and could redirect the flows of goods and power. Enemies were not only waves and shaking earth, but ambitious princes across the water who turned admiration into occupation. The palatial world of Crete, that once dazzled visitors with painted dolphins and bull games and magazines deep with harvests, ended as so many empires do, not in one day, but in a series of ruinous seasons that stripped away confidence and left people to choose smaller lives in safer places. The ruins remained. At Nasus, a throne of stone sits still in a room watched by painted griffins, the basin dry, the plaster cracked. At Palicastro, a shattered cult statue lay where fire and force broke it. The ivory limbs and gold leaf scattered across a floor of blackened debris. At Zakros, the storerooms that once smelled of oil and wool hold only dust. Later generations would remember a king named Minos, and a maze and a monster. A myth made from the memory of a power that once ruled with fleets rather than with walls. The real story is written in ash, in clay tablets that changed language, in wave-laid sands on northern shores. And in the sudden silence of courts that had guided an island for centuries, across the high spine of central Anatolia, the land rises in a great wind-combed plateau, cut by cold rivers and ringed by dark mountains. Winters are iron, and summers burn under a hard sky. Oaks cling to the hillsides and step. Grass runs to the horizon. At the great bend of the Kazalurmak River, there is a limestone hill with gullies and ledges where eagles wheel and jackals cry at dusk. Here the Hittites set their capital and called it Hattusa, from this fortress of stone and timber. They reached out to gather scattered towns into a kingdom that would one day stand among the powers of the late Bronze Age, before the Hittites came. Others had named and worked these valleys. The Hashans spoke their own tongue and venerated their own gods in shrines of wood and clay. To the south and east, Assyrian merchants from the city of Assur opened trading stations in the 19th and 18th centuries before the Common Era. Most famously, at Kanish, near modern Kayseri. They brought tin for bronze and fine textiles, and kept careful accounts on clay tablets. Thousands of those tablets have been found in the ruins of their warehouses. And through them, we watched local Anatolian lords bargain for metal and pledges. While caravans creak along the winter roads, out of this marketplace of languages and gods, there rose a people who spoke an early Indo-European tongue and learned to write it with borrowed signs. The Hittites took the cuneiform of the Assyrians and bent it to their own speech. And with that act, they fixed their voice more firmly in the earth than any city wall. Their earliest history comes to us in shards. A king named Anita of Kusara tells how he sacked Hattusa and laid a curse on anyone who tried to rebuild it. Yet a century later, a ruler who took the name Hattusa defied the curse and made the hill his own seat. From Hattusa, he marched against the cities of the north and the west and the south, tightening the ring around his capital with each campaign. He left an edict for his descendants that survives in clay, recounting how he bound nobles to oath and set his grandson as heir above older rivals. In those lines, we hear a kingdom being hammered into shape, not only by the sword but by law and ceremony. After Hattusili came Mursili, who drove his army over mountain passes and across the Euphrates, took Aleppo, and pushed on to Babylon. His sack of that old city around 1595, before the Common Era ended a dynasty and startled the Near East, it was a feat as audacious as it was distant from home, and it shows a state already confident in its strength. Yet the triumph was followed by palace intrigue and murder, reminders that power in Hattusa was still a quarrelsome thing. The ground that carried these kings to war also taught them caution. North of Hattusa, the Pontic Mountains shelter the Casca Highland tribes, who moved like wolves across the ridges to burn fields and carry off herds. To the west lay the lands of Arzawa, with their own princes and Luwian speech. To the south, the old Hurrian realm of Aleppo guarded the road to Syria, and farther east, the Hurrians gathered into the rising state we call Mitanni. Famed for chariotry and horse training, The Hittite heartland sits between these rivals and raiders, exposed on three sides. Anchored only by its hard hills and its stubborn towns, it is little wonder that Hattusa grew into a fortress city with terraces cut from rock, casemate walls running for leagues, ramps and towers, and gates guarded by carved lions and sphinxes. The great earthen rampart at Urkapi carries a wall like a crown, and beneath it, a postern tunnel pierces the bank so that men could pass unseen in a siege. Water channels and cisterns sank into the hill so that the city could drink even when fields burned. No single work tells you more about Hittite temperament than those stone defenses, built not to dazzle, but to endure. In the lower city stood the great temple dedicated to the storm god of Hatti and the sun goddess of Irina. Storerooms held pithoi and bins. Its courts bore the marks of ritual processions, and its thresholds were worn by the feet of priests and petitioners. Above, in the upper city, dozens of smaller sanctuaries served a pantheon so generous that later scribes called their land the realm of 1,000 gods. They did not scorn foreign deities, but adopted them with their rites and names. When the Hittites conquered a town, they often took its god into their own lists and built it a house in Hattusa. The royal family guarded this abundance of cults through a sacred office that outlasted kings. The queen bore the title Tawanana, and that title clung to the person of the queen for life, so that a new king might rule beside his mother as sovereign priestess before his own consort ascended. In this mixture of piety and policy, we see a court that understood how ceremony steadies a throne. Their laws give another window into the house they were building. The Hittite law code survives in copies that show corrections and additions across generations. It is notably sparing with death. Where Babylon often punished with the sword, Hattusa preferred compensation in silver or service. Fines scaled by status and circumstance fill the tablets. A thief owes more if he steals from a temple store. A man who injures another can settle matters by agreed payment rather than by blood. There are harsh lines too, but the impression is of a state that treats law as a tool to reconcile neighbors, and to keep farmers in their fields and smiths at their forges. This preference for order over spectacle is the same spirit that laid out granaries within the city walls and kept clay archives in wooden chests. The craft of writing became the backbone of government. Hattusa's scribes kept tablets in Hittite for domestic business and in Akkadian for foreign letters. They copied myths and rituals from the Hashans and the Hurrians, recorded festivals that moved with the seasons, and archived treaties with vassals and rivals. Out among the rocks, 2 leagues from the city, lies Yatsulikaya, a sanctuary cut into limestone where reliefs of gods and files stride along the walls. There, the storm god meets the mother goddess on the main panel, while lesser deities pass with their names carved above them. The place likely served as a house of the New Year festival, when the king visited the gods before leading the land into another cycle of sowing and war. It is both a book and a chapel made of stone. Hittite armies marched from these rituals into harsh work. Plateau favors horses, and the Hittites became masters of the chariot. At first, a team pulled a 2-man car. Later, a 3-man crew added a shield bearer to protect the driver and archer. Their state drew on vassal contingents from a wide ring of allied or subdued cities, so that when a king called, men in carts came in from Aleppo, from Carchemish on the Euphrates, from the towns of western Anatolia, bound by oath and by the fear of royal anger. Campaigns left their trace in the royal annals. The north is a litany of raids and reprisals against the Casca, who were never finally beaten. The west tells of struggles with Arzawa. The south opens onto Syria, where trade routes and rich cities beckoned. It is in these struggles that the Hittites learned diplomacy as carefully as war, for every advance risked a new front, and every victory required a treaty to hold it. What did their cities look like as this kingdom took shape? Hattusa sprawled across broken terrain, a maze of wards and terraces with the palace districts set high, so that the king could look over storehouses and stables and watch smoke rise from hundreds of hearths. The wall is built in sections with stone foundations and mud brick above, studded with towers that command steep slopes and blind turns. At the Lion Gate, 2 great beasts carved from single blocks watch over a passage still worn where wheels and sandals passed. At the King's Gate, a warrior figure stands with horned headdress and sword to guard the approach. Inside the great temple, 2 courtyards lead to inner rooms where offerings were made. And galleries of storerooms hold the remains of grain and oil that kept the city when winter closed mountain passes. Roads paved in stone lead out to satellite towns and to the sacred spring at Afletin-Penor, where a monumental relief of deities later watched water slide over ashlar blocks. Even the countryside bears their touch in rock reliefs, where kings present offerings to gods upon cliff faces, so that the land itself becomes a witness and a contract. When we speak of their rise, we must mention the one feat that announced them to distant peoples. After taking Aleppo, Mursili led his troops along the Euphrates into Mesopotamia and sacked Babylon. He did not try to rule there. He withdrew as quickly as he had come, perhaps carrying riches and captives, and certainly leaving a power vacuum that others rushed to fill. The gesture was both a blow and a message. It told the world that a new force sat in the Anatolian highlands, and that its reach was longer than many had guessed. At home, the blow echoed in palace murder and usurpation, reminders that Hattusa was still teaching itself how to pass a crown from hand to hand without cutting the palm that held it. By the end of this first period, the Hittite state had forged the tools of its later greatness. A capital set like a strong tooth in the jaw of the plateau. A pantheon large enough to absorb gods of every town and tribe. A law that favored settlement and compensation. An archive that remembered promises and curses. A chariot arm that could move fast over bad ground. A diplomacy that learned to bind vassals with oaths sealed before gods who punish oath-breakers. Against them stood hungry neighbors, mountain raiders, and princes across the sea who watched the same trade routes. Between those weights, the House of Hatti found its balance and began to call itself a great kingdom. In the 13th and late 14th centuries, before the Common Era, the House of Hatti stood shoulder to shoulder with the greatest realms of its age. From Hattusa, on the cold plateau, the kings of the Hittites stretched command south to the warm lands of Syria, west to the Aegean shore, and east to the bend of the Euphrates. The empire did not look like a single block of color on a tidy map. It was a web of stone cities and loyal or fearful vassal states strung along roads and rivers. At the center sat Hattusa, with its terrace walls and crowded archives. Beyond the central hills rose provincial capitals that were kingdoms in their own right under Hittite princes. Carchemish guarded the crossings of the Euphrates and watched the caravan routes to Mesopotamia. Aleppo commanded the north gate into Syria. Farther south, coastal Ugarit spoke many tongues in its markets and paid its tribute by ship and overland caravan alike. Each of these hubs anchored a ring of lesser towns that sent grain and soldiers when the great king called. The empire took shape under Suppiluliuma, who rebuilt Hittite fortunes with iron will and careful treaty-making. He smashed the old Hurrian confederacy of Mitanni, married into dynasties, and set his sons as viceroys over the conquered Syrian lands, so that royal blood stood at every hinge of the southern frontier. His name traveled so far that when a young pharaoh died in Egypt without an heir, the widowed queen sent a desperate letter to Hattusa, asking for a Hittite prince to marry and take the throne. Suppiluliuma sent his son north through unfriendly ground, only for the prince to be killed before he reached the Nile. The episode poisoned relations with Egypt for a generation and set the stage for wars along the Orontes River, where Hittite and Egyptian armies stalked one another among fortified towns. Hattusa in these years was a capital in full stride. The lower city centered on the great temple to the storm god of Hatti and the sun goddess of Erina. Its twin courtyards were paved and swept, storerooms laid out in long ranges where jars could be tallied by scribes with reed pens. The upper city rose behind miles of wall that climbed the spine of the hill and ran along the crest of Yerkapi, where a stone-faced ramp carried the wall like a causeway into the sky. Gates flanked by lions and sphinx admitted processions on holy days and armies on campaign days. In palaces of timber and stone, the court received envoys who brought letters on clay from pharaohs and kings. Akkadian served for diplomacy, the international speech of that world, while Hittite clay kept domestic accounts. Tablets recorded treaties, law codes, ration lists, land grants, and oaths that summoned the wrath of gods on any man who broke his word. When fire came in later ages, it baked these tablets hard, and so accident made an immortal library of the Hittite state. Power in Hatti was never only fortification and fear. It was also administration and ritual. The kings bound their vassals by treaties that were works of art and obligation. They named the parties, recited the history of favor and rebellion, set exact terms for tribute and military aid, and called on a roll of gods to witness the signatures. They listed curses for breaking faith that chilled the blood. The treaties reached from the Luwian-speaking lands of western Anatolia to Wailusa on the northwestern fringe, which many have identified with Troy, and the south across Syria, where cities like Khatna and Ugarit swore fealty. A treaty with a prince named Alexander of Wailusa shows Hittite kingship projecting law across the sea roads, while tablets from Ugarit balance accounts in silver for timber and copper and purple-dyed cloth. The law at the center created order at the edges. War made that law credible. The Hittite army moved with a corps of heavy chariots, drawn by swift horses and with ranks of infantry from the heartland and from vassal contingents. Horse training was a science. An old manual, attributed to a master trainer who served Mitanni but was copied in Hattusa, gives a program of conditioning that speaks of measured trotting intervals, watering times, and rest days. It is a rare voice of craft from an age of kings. In battle, the Hittites often used a three-man chariot crew: driver, archer, and shieldman. A platform for shock and for archery that could break enemy lines if properly supported. Supply moved along royal roads that crossed the plateau in long stages marked by wells and posting stations. In winter, armies went home. In spring, the king made sacrifice at Yatzilakaya, where processions of carved gods stride along limestone walls, and then he called the land to arms again. The clash with Egypt defined the pride of the age. When Muwatalli sat on the throne in Hattusa and Ramesses II wore the crowns of the two lands. Both men looked to the same strip of cities in the Orontes Valley. Kadesh stood like a nail in that plank. Ramesses marched north with 4 divisions and surprised a Hittite chariot force, then found himself ambushed by the main Hittite army, which crashed through his camp in a storm of dust and arrows. The day seesawed. Egyptian accounts on temple walls in Thebes claim a god led the pharaoh back into the fight and saved the host. Hittite records speak more dryly of a stout defense and a siege abandoned, because neither side could finish the other with fresh troops in reach. What matters most is what followed. Perfect victory could not be had, so diplomacy took its place. A generation later, Hattusili III and Ramesses II concluded a formal peace that survives in both kingdoms' copies. It pledged mutual defense, the extradition of fugitives, and oaths before a great roll of gods to seal the friendship. An Egyptian royal wedding joined Ramesses to a Hittite princess in a ceremony recorded amid the pomp of Thebes. It is the earliest surviving international treaty of its kind, and it speaks to the Hittite conviction that law and oath could do what spears alone could not. The empire's enemies did not stand only in the south. To the north, the Casca clans descended from the Pontic forests to burn fields and trouble the edges of Hattusa year after year. They were poor in cities and rich in stubbornness. Their raids were part of every king's annals like a season of bad weather. To the west, the lands of Arzawa and the shadowy power that Hittite texts call Ahiawa, which many link to the Mycenaean world, pushed and pulled the frontier. Sometimes a prince in western Anatolia accepted a Hittite treaty and sent hostages to guarantee good behavior. Sometimes he appealed to Ahiawa and brought in swords from across the sea. Kings in Hattusa wrote sharp letters to foreign lords, demanding the return of runaways and the punishment of rebels who claimed foreign protection. The West was a chessboard where diplomacy, marriage, and sudden marches of troops tried to keep a lid on a pot that always wanted to boil. Within the empire, rulers experimented with ways to steady what they had won. Muwatalli shifted the royal seat south to a new city called Dahuntasa to be closer to the Syrian front and perhaps to ease the burden of the northern Casca threat. After him, Hattusa restored Hattusa as capital, but kept family members as viceroys in Carchemish and Aleppo, so that royal authority in the south wore a face that subjects could respect. Tudalia IV undertook public works to nurse the heartland through dry years, repaired dams and reservoirs, and reorganized the state cults so that gods received due offerings in the proper season. We see a conscious effort to manage climate and faith with the same deliberate hand used to shape law and battle order. The look of Hittite power showed in their cities. Carchemish was a city of merchants and garrisons, a place where envoys from Babylon and Assyria met with princes descended from Hattusa's line. Ugarit, on the coast, shone with bilingual tablets in Ugaritic alphabet and in cuneiform, with merchant houses stacked with ingots and amphorae, shipyards that could send a message by sail faster than any road. In these places, Hittite overseers balanced books and collected tribute, but also allowed local kings to display their own gods and dynastic pride, so long as the oaths held and the road to Hattusa remained open. It was a federated empire managed by paper and oath as much as by sword. In the court, the presence of queens steadied dynastic change. The title Tawanana clung to the queen for life, and documents show strong royal women who administered estates, oversaw cults, and corresponded with foreign courts. When a new king took the throne, his consort waited for the passing of the elder queen before she took the sacred office, and that delay could shape faction and policy. The royal family spread its branches across the empire through viceroyalties and governorships, web of kinship that increased loyalty, yet also multiplied rivalries that had to be managed with care. Culture at the height of Hittite power carried a composite face. In the sanctuaries, gods bore Hashan, Hurrian, and Luwian names side by side. In the archives, Hittite myths sit with Hurrian hymns. Scribes sent letters to Egypt in Akkadian formulas, while recording local disputes in their own tongue. The empire fed on metals from Taurus mines, on Syrian timber, on grain from Anatolian plains. On horses raised under northern skies, it minted little coin because its wealth moved in kind, yet its accounts are precise. When we picture a royal audience at Hattusa in this age, we should imagine a hall hung with colored textiles, with bronze vessels bright as mirrors, with envoys of many lands, and with a king who knew as much about the clauses of a treaty and the training of a horse as he did about omens drawn from the flight of birds. There is a last measure of this height. When foreign kings wrote to Hattusa, they addressed the great king as brother. The Amarna letters from an earlier generation show the habit begun, and the later treaty texts make it permanent. Between Egypt and Hatti, the word brother meant equal peer under heaven, with whom one could exchange gifts of gold and lapis and brides without loss of face. No phrase better captures how far the Hittites had come from the days when their kings fought over who would hold the hill of Hattusa. They had climbed to a place where their word could bind princes from the Aegean to the Euphrates, and where their chariots could make that word good. The empire of Hatti entered its last century with the look of strength still upon it. From the terraces of Hattusa, the walls ran like gray rivers over the ridges. The archives were thick with tablets. The viceroys in Carchemish and Aleppo still rode out with processions of gods before them. Beneath the stone, the seams had begun to split. The Heartland Plateau is a hard country that depends on winter snow and spring rain, and the climate turned against it. Tree rings from old Anatolian junipers speak of narrow growth and failed seasons, and in the reckoning of later scholars, a grim sequence appears near the end of the 13th century before the Common Era, when 3 dry years followed, one upon another. On such a plateau, 1 failed harvest can be endured, and 2 will empty granaries. A 3rd strips the bark from the state itself. Hittite letters from the last rains beg for grain from the south. The king writes to Ugarit and to other ports, asking that ships be loaded with barley and sent north without delay. When the capital must import bread by sea, security has already thinned to a paper skin. Hunger does not come alone. The same drought that pinched the plateau also drove peoples from hills and forests to the north. The Casca pressed closer, slipping through the Pontic ravines to burn outlying villages and carry off herds while the field armies were away. To the west, the lands of Arzawa and the princes who looked across the water to Ahiawa tested the frontier. To the south, the cities of Syria that once paid tribute with measured silver faced their own storms. Ugarit's last tablets tell of enemy ships off the coast and of messengers who could not ride the roads because the land was full of foes. The king of that city wrote in panic to a neighbor and received a reply as bleak as winter, for the neighbor could send no help because his own fields were on fire. In Egypt, a generation later, the scribes would carve on the walls of Medinet Habu how sea peoples came with their families in ox carts and with their fleets in line, and how all the lands to the north fell in ruin. The Hittites did not leave such boastful carvings. but the pattern lines up like beads. The last kings of Hatti fought to steady the house while the timbers groaned. Supiliama, too, who bears the name of a great ancestor, led campaigns to the south coast and boasted of victories over Elatia, which is the island of copper men called Cyprus. Inscriptions speak of battles at sea, a rare note for a land power, as if even the kings of the plateau had been forced to learn the war of waves to keep grain ships moving and to cut the roads of raiders. Inland, royal hands tried to stitch up old rips. Tudalia IV before him had rebuilt dams and reservoirs and rewoven the great festivals so that the gods received their due and the land might return to balance. Hattusili had written peace with Egypt to bind the southern front. Yet every cure came too late, or held only for a season. When the climate robs the fields, and when neighbors feel the weakness in the pulse of a state, policy must fight the sky as well as the sword. Few kingdoms can manage both at once for long. The political map within the empire showed cracks of its own. Earlier in the century, Muwatalli had moved the royal seat to Tarhun Tassa to be nearer to Syria and farther from the Casca. And after him, a relative named Kurenta claimed that city and its realm, leaving a scar of rivalry that later kings could not quite close. Western Anatolia held princes who smiled in Hittite courts and wrote obedient letters, then turned to seek favor from Ahiawa when the wind shifted. Vassal kings in Syria counted on Hittite garrisons to keep enemies at bay. But when the grain carts failed and the chariot teams grew thin, garrisons melted away. And the oaths and the treaty tablets felt like old songs sung to empty seats. In such hours, even faithful clients hedged their bets. A federated empire that lives by treaty and shared worship can stretch wide when roads are safe and harvests fat. When roads fill with refugees and the storehouses echo, the cords loosen fast. The ruin left marks that the ground still holds. Hattusa's upper city shows blackened debris where the great temple quarter once kept its pitho and its bins. Gate passages are choked with tumbled brick and ash-fired clay. The postern tunnel under the Yerkapi rampart still breathes cool air, but above it, the crown of wall collapsed and was never raised again. There is no clear layer of mass slaughter, no single storm of bodies piled in streets, which tells its own tale. The city was evacuated or bled dry before the final fires. The Casca, who had long haunted the northern marches, likely walked the empty courts and stripped carved lintels for their huts. The old capital fell silent and stayed so for centuries, unlike some cities that are rebuilt again and again on their own bones. Hattusa did not rise a second time in that age. That quiet is one of the starkest facts of the end. Farther south, the fall took a different form. Carchemish on the Euphrates endured. There, the line of Hittite viceroys and princes weathered the storm, cut loose from the high plateau and its burning fields, and built new houses on the river trade. From these roots grew the patchwork of states we call Neo-Hittite city kingdoms, with Luwian speech written in hieroglyphic signs on stone: Alut in the Malacha Plain, Kumal on the upper Euphrates, Girgam in the hills of Karam and Merak, Hattin near the Orontes, Samel at Zincirli, and Q on the Silacine Plain, each carved local realms with walls and stelae that show kings standing before gods, while Assyrian and Aramean neighbors pressed around them. These were heirs by blood and custom, not by power, and in time, Assyria folded them into its own iron order. Their survival shows that Hittite strength did not vanish in one breath. It retreated to river and hill and changed its voice. The reasons for the end gather like storm clouds from many directions. Climate stress stripped the heartland of surplus and forced the capital to beg for grain by sea. Trade networks that fed bronze with tin and copper snapped in many places, so that smiths had no steady supply of metal, and chariot workshops lacked fittings and nails. Raiders from sea and forest turned roads into traps, so that letters arrived late if they arrived at all. Internal politics offered no unbroken hand to steer with. Famine fed unrest in villages, and soldiers, loyal to pay and rations, began to drift home to guard their own kin. When a federated empire that holds 1,000 towns by oath and custom cannot deliver food, protection, and ritual in season, the oaths unravel and the custom turns to memory. There is one more older wound that may have weakened the body. In the reign of Suppiluliuma I, long before the final century, plague came into the land after soldiers returned from campaigns in the south. Royal prayers from that time ask why the pest does not lift and whether a broken oath has angered the gods. For years, the court lost officials and kin to fever. Generations later, these texts were still copied, which means the memory of the pest and the fear of divine anger stayed strong in royal minds. A state that must perform great seasonal festivals to renew. Its covenant with the gods and the land will suffer double when famine and disease interrupt the rites. Yatsulakaya's procession of stone gods may have seen lean offerings in the last years, an absence that would have troubled king and commoner alike. By the first decades of the 12th century, before the Common Era, the empire was gone. The treaties that had named kings and listed curses lay in burned archives. The lions at the gate of Hattusa stared over empty ground. The viceroy of Carchemish still sent letters and counted caravans and received ambassadors. But he spoke now for his own city and its ring of allies, rather than for a plateau-wide kingdom. In the countryside of central Anatolia, new peoples took root. Later ages would name some of them Phrygians, and some Mushki, and others by names now lost. They built with timber and stone on old mounds and plowed fields where Hittite farmers had once brought in winter wheat. The land did not forget the old order. Reliefs at rock faces still showed Hittite kings offering to storm gods. Local shepherds told stories of giants who had carved such works. Thus the Hittite Empire ceased, not in one battle, but in the convergence of failed reigns. Empty roads, burning towns, and hungry borders. The disappearance is sudden in the written record, because the records themselves ended when the last archive burned and the last scribe fled. Yet the people did not vanish in an instant. They shifted to other courts, other scripts, other loyalties. Their gods took new forms. Their language survived in borrowed prayers and in rock-cut hieroglyphs for a time before falling quiet. The kingdom that had matched Egypt in treaty and Mitanni in chariotry. And Assyria in law left its stones along the Kozlomak and its treaties in baked clay, and then the wind took the rest. Where the rivers spread their brown fingers into the Gulf of Mexico, where mangrove thickets breathe in the tide and slow waters coil around islands of dark soil. A people of builders and carvers and kings took shape. Their world was the low country of the southern Gulf Coast and the modern lands of Veracruz and Tabasco. A plain crossed by the Coatzaco Alcos and the embraided streams that rise in the evergreen mountains and spill to the sea. The air is heavy there, the earth soft and generous, the seasons divided by rain and more rain. It is a country of swamps and levees, of fish-rich lagoons and alluvial fields, and in that saturated abundance, the first great civilization of Mesoamerica grew. Later neighbors would call them the rubber people, because they knew the jungle S trees and the trick of making a ball that could leap from stone. But the names they gave themselves are lost. What remains are their cities raised on earth and clay, their stones pulled from distant volcanoes, and an art so sure of itself that it still startles the eye across 3,000 years. The earliest stirrings can be felt at a sacred spring called El, near the hills east of the Coatzacoalcos Basin, with the peat-preserved wooden busts, carved smooth and graceful. Bundles of greenstone celts that had never struck a tree, and spheres of cured latex that once bounced in ritual play. The offerings were laid down in the centuries around 1600 before the Common Era, proof that ceremony and skilled carving reached a high pitch, before the great centers took final form. Soon after, on a natural ridge above floodplain and marsh, the community we know as San Lorenzo rose in tears. The builders cut and filled and leveled until the crown of the ridge became a platform large enough to carry courts, plazas, and elite compounds. They piped water through U-shaped basalt drains that still lie where they were set, part of a planned system that delivered clean flow to terraces and may have supplied ritual pools that flashed in the sun. In the rich land below, farmers tended maize and beans and gourds, kept dogs and later turkeys, fished the backwaters, and cut cane for house walls that stood on packed earth platforms. The common houses vanished with the seasons and the insects. But the great platform endured because the people renewed it generation on generation with basket loads of fill. From the northwest, from the dark cone fields of the Tuxtla Mountains, came the stone that crowned their ambition. Basalt from Cerro Sintpec and other peaks was quarried in heavy masses, roughed out in the highlands, then levered to riverbanks and floated on rafts down twisting channels to the cities of the plain. In courtyards at San Lorenzo and later at La Venta, the stone became altars and thrones, and heads that could look a man in the eye. The colossal heads, some higher than 2 men and heavy as a field full of soil, wear close-fitting helmets and carry the facial marks of living rulers. Each is an individual with high cheekbones or fleshy lips, with a gaze that is calm or severe, with a crest or a cord on the helmet that speaks of lineage and office. They were not gods, they were kings frozen in basalt. Proof that power had taken human shape and could be seen from across a plaza. As San Lorenzo reached its strength, a second heart rose on a swamp-ringed island farther east. La Venta sits today as a long earthen spine in the Tabasco marshes, but in its age, the place was a city planned with an axis and a face. Builders piled earth and clay into a sacred mountain, a great conical pyramid of packed fill, that stood above the palm groves and red beds like a man-made volcano, answering the real cones on the horizon. Plazas stretched north and south along a central line, offset from true north by several degrees. A deliberate orientation that repeats in later sites and suggests a reckoning of sky and season. Along this spine rose low platforms that carried temples and elite houses of wood and thatch, while beneath the plazas lay offerings sealed forever from the light. In one place, a mosaic pavement of worked serpentine was fitted like a green mask and then buried while still new. In others, rows of jade celts were set upright in patterns, as if to plant an eternal field of precious stone. The ground under La Venta is as carefully composed as the architecture above it. A city that is also a reliquary. Trade and pilgrimage bound the low country to the mountains and 2 far valleys. Jadeite of a blue-green hue came from the Motagua River Valley in distant Guatemala, carried through passes and along canoe routes to the Gulf, where carvers turned it into celts, ear spools, and masks so smooth they feel like water in the hand, iron, or mere discs of magnetite. And hematite gleamed with the dawn and likely served in rites where sunlight and reflection mattered more than words. Obsidian blades from highland sources in central Mexico arrived in bundles wrapped against their bite. Conch shells and spondylus from the warm seas added their pale glitter to caches and costumes. In return, the Gulf lowlands sent finished work and the prestige of a style that traveled far. Reliefs carved on the cliffs of Chalcatzingo and the Morelos Hills show rulers seated in caves amid curling clouds in the unmistakable manner of the lowlands. A sign that the symbols and claims of the Marsh Kings were read and copied in the high country. The figure that moves through their art is part child and part cat, with a cleft brow and a mouth that turns down into a curl of power. Scholars call it the Wer-Jaguar, a name from later stories, but the thing itself is older than any tale we have. It is carved on celts, modeled in jade, and set in clay figurines that fit the palm. Rulers are shown cradling such beings, as if they were heir and god at once. From thrones cut with niches, a lord emerges as from a cave, holding a rope that binds a captive or a child born to a fate larger than a single life. The message is constant. The ruler holds the line between worlds. He sits at the mouth of the earth's serpent. He brings rain and maize by rites that open the way for gods to walk the plazas. Pyramids and buried offerings make a stage for this ritual kingship. And the water drains that carry the rains through stone turn the city itself into a living diagram of flows between sky and underworld. The politics of the rise can be read in the movement of stone and the remaking of platforms. San Lorenzo was first among equals for several centuries. From about 1400 to 900 before the Common Era, its mound mass was heavier than any other, its drains more elaborate, its heads and altars more numerous. Then its power waned, and La Venta took the mantle. The reasons were likely many. Channels shift, and floodplains change. And the ridge that had been a blessing for San Lorenzo may have been cut off from easy water. La Venta controlled an islanded node on the coastward side of the lowlands, a place better suited to gather pilgrims and traders and to project authority outward. The shift did not erase the old elite. Sculptures from San Lorenzo were dragged away, defaced, and recarved at La Venta into new monuments, violent recycling that reads like history struck with a hammer. The court that ruled La Venta for 3 centuries knew how to claim past glory and turn it to present use. What did their cities and people look like when this power was new? Imagine the long line of La Venta at dawn, with mist lifting off the marsh, the conical pyramid rising like a green-gold hill above the palms, the main plaza stretching toward the north, the earthen platforms catching the first light. On the packed clay court stands a throne carved from a single block of basalt. Its front a deep niche, where a seated figure holds a rope that runs to a kneeling captive on one flank. A line of stone columns stands like a palisade of trunks turned to stone. In the shadow of the pyramid, workers open a trench to receive a cache of jade celts. Each celt ground to a careful sheen and set up right in a fan, so that from above it would look like a sprouting field. Beyond the temple zone, the living city spreads along levees and artificial islands. Houses are raised on platforms to lift them above flood. Looms click in the shade where cotton and maguey become cloth and cord. Fishermen slip into canoe channels cut through the reeds. In a workshop, a carver leans over a block of basalt, checking a curve against the memory of a face he has seen in audience. On the ridge at San Lorenzo, masons lift a basalt drain into a trench and tap it level with a tool of hardwood. When the first rains come, the water will run true. Writing was not their first language. They spoke in stone and clay and in the placement of things. Yet somewhere in the late reign of La Venta, a portable text was born. The Cascaill block, a smooth slab of serpentine covered with rows of incised signs, appears to hold a local script in a sequence that suggests ordered reading. The signs are not yet understood, and the context is lost. But the artifact tells us that record-keeping began to rise from the realm of image toward the realm of written speech, before the old centers faded in later centuries. The heirs of this tradition, on the isthmus, would cut dates and names with confident strokes. But the seed may have been planted among these swamp-born kings, who needed more than seal stones and memory to run their courts. The rise cannot be separated from the jungle's gifts: rubber for balls and binding, cacao for drink that quickens the heart, hardwoods for beams and canoes, fish and turtles for protein, birds for bright feathers, and fertile silts renewed by flood for maize fields that could carry a city. They learned the grace of raising ground above water and of cutting channels to move goods and people through a forest of reeds. They perfected earthwork architecture on a scale that seems understated beside later stone cities, but with an order and a persistence that made hills where there were none and turned islands into sacred mountains. They gathered stone from far peaks because the lowlands had none. And by that labor, they declared that power lived on their platforms, and not only where basalt was born, and by the time La Venta reached its full breadth, around 900 to 500 before the Common Era, the Low Country was the theater of a cosmology built in mud and jade. The layout of the site measured the world in lines and cardinal points. The pyramid was the axis that joined sky and earth. The buried mosaics and offerings were messages to the powers below. The colossal heads fixed the faces of living lords on the edge of plazas where crowds could see them. The art that traveled to high valleys and coastal slopes carried that same message in smaller form, where local princes seated themselves in caves carved into stone or war, ear spools of green that whispered of authority learned from the marsh. Thus the Olmec rose, not by fortress walls or written decrees, but by reshaping the land, and placing kings at the center of a ritual map that tied river, mountain, and sea. Their cities looked like islands made intentional, their courts like earth made into memory. They set the pattern of sacred rulership, of planned ceremonial centers, of long-distance exchange in precious goods, and of a visual language that later peoples would adopt and make their own. At La Venta, the Low Country gathered itself into ceremony and command. The city rose from the marsh like a crafted island, its spine a planned axis that drew the eye toward a man-made mountain of packed earth. Around that pyramid stretched broad plazas edged with low platforms where wooden halls once stood. Their walls painted and roofed in palm, their floors hard with burnished clay. Within the sacred precinct, known to archaeologists as Complex A, columns of basalt from the Tuxtlas were planted upright in ranks to fence sanctuaries of soil and jade. Beneath the plazas lay offerings as carefully arranged as any temple above the ground. Serpentine blocks fitted into green mosaics were laid flat and then buried forever. Rows of jadeite celts stood on edge like a field of blades awaiting rain. In one cache, A procession of tiny stone figures faces a set of polished celts, as if standing before a council of ancestors. These hidden works show a city that planned as much below the surface as upon it, a capital that composed the earth as a kind of scripture. From this ceremonial heart, the rulers projected a vision of order that bound the swamp and the ridge, the river and the sea. They were kings, who were also priests, men whose likenesses stare out from colossal heads, with helmets tight to the brow and cords that signaled rank. Thrones carved from single blocks show a seated lord inside a cave-shaped niche, with a rope looped to a captive or a child. In these scenes, the ruler sits at the mouth of the underworld and holds the line between worlds. The court managed water with equal care. Basalt drains carried clean flow across terraces, a feat practical for daily life and potent in ritual. Since flowing water is the oldest metaphor of blessing in lands of flood and drought, feasting sealed the bond between center and countryside. Animal bones and serving vessels from ceremonial zones speak of gatherings where food and drink were consumed in quantity, and the hierarchy was reaffirmed in public gaze. Economy and statecraft traveled together along watery roads. Jadeite from the Motagua Valley in the distant highlands came down to the coast and up the rivers to La Venta, where court lapidaries drilled beads and ground ear spools, until they shone like living leaves. Obsidian arrived from far volcanic fields, its colors betraying sources in the central Mexican and Guatemalan highlands. And blades from those cores gleam still with an edge that can shave hair. Mirror discs of magnetite and hematite, likely from the mountains to the west and south, caught sun and firelight and may have served in rites of divination and kingship. In return, the Gulf sent finished objects and a grammar of sacred images that strangers learned as one learns a strong language. At Chalcatzingo in the highland Piedmont, a lord sits within a mountain cave amid curling clouds in the lowland manner. Proof that the prestige of the marsh kings reached into valleys where maize fields run up to dry hillsides. On the Pacific slope at Izapa and along the Chiapas Depression, altars and steely baroforms first seen in the swamp. The reach was not conquest in the manner of marching armies, but a weaving of trade. Marriage, pilgrimage, and imitation, all of it anchored by the ability of La Venta to host and to give. Politics can be read in stone and fill as clearly as in letters. La Venta drew labor from a wide hinterland to raise its pyramid and renew its platforms. Such works presume a hierarchy that could command seasons of toil and compensate the people with protection. Feasting, and the promise that the gods favored the hand that built. Thrones and colossal heads were set and then reset, some recarved from older monuments, suggesting that new rulers reworked the faces and claims of their predecessors to suit present need. The court anchored its power with shrines on the margins of the city, little stations at levee ends and canal mouths where symbols were renewed and crop rites performed, so that villages saw the center as the guardian of harvest and flood. Rivals in neighboring districts answered with their own platforms and carvings, and sometimes with defacement and removal of La Venta-style sculptures. For the politics of this landscape was a long conversation in stone that included threat and theft as well as homage. Religion shaped the daily look of power. Sacred Mountain was not only the Great Pyramid, it was also the living horizon of the Tuxtlas brought into the city by basalt and by icon. The word jaguar child with cleft brow appears in jade and clay as a being both tender and terrible. Carried by rulers in public rite, a sign that rulership was thought to channel storm, fertility, and lightning, stingray spines, shark teeth, and bloodletting implements found in offerings point to rites of wounding that drew life from life to secure favor from the hidden world.
Wonderful when
And stone ball courts at later sites showed that ritual play was already a language of cosmos and rule. Leventa gathered these practices into a calendar of processions across its courts, so that the very movement of priests and dancers measured the year. At their zenith, the Olmec centers looked both sumptuous and ordered. Approach Leventa by canoe in the season after rains. The swamp breathes at either hand. Herons lift and settle among the reeds, and the platform of the city rises out of water like the back of a long beast. The cone of the pyramid stands beyond a wide plaza. Thrones of basalt sit at the edges like black altars. In the shade of an elite compound, jade beads lie in trays beside shell and obsidian. While a carver tests the bite of a drill, across the river at a feeder village, women grind maize with stone matades, and men mend nets before carrying baskets of fish to the causeway that runs up to the court. In the evening, the rulers descend the pyramid steps to light braziers before a line of buried offerings that no commoner will ever see. Proof that mystery is as necessary to power as bread. Thus, the height of the Olmec world rested on three pillars. First, mastery of earthwork architecture that turned swamp and ridge into a map of cosmos. Second, a long-distance economy. Precious things that tied distant valleys to the Gulf and made the court a broker of beauty and prestige. Third, a theology of kingship, in which the ruler stood between worlds and guaranteed rain and harvest through rite and spectacle. Enemies shifted with the channels and the seasons. The first answered with imitation and theft, the second with flood and drought. For a time, Leventa met both with surplus, ceremony, and stone. Enemies were rival lords and restless waters. The first answered with imitation and theft, the second with flood and drought. For a time, Leventa met both with surplus, ceremony, and stone. The low country that had fed the courts with fish and maize and bright stones also contained the seed of their undoing. Rivers on the Gulf Plain are living creatures. They meander and split. They shed old channels and open new mouths to the sea. Around 900 years before the Common Era, San Lorenzo's ridge lost its favor. Channels that once brought easy water and traffic shifted away, and the engineered drains that had carried clean flow across terraces fell silent. In the final phases, the great platforms show hurried repairs. Monuments were toppled or buried, and some were hacked to pieces and cast into ravines. Colossal heads that once faced across plazas with the assurance of living rulers were recut from older thrones. Their new faces set where a lord had once sat within a niche. The violence recorded in stone speaks to political overturn as clearly as any written chronicle. A ruling house fell, and its emblems were mutilated to break the spell of its name. When the ridge lost its water and its masters lost their luck, the center that had commanded the marsh for centuries began to empty. The farms and hamlets on the levees endured, but the voice courtly city dwindled to a memory carried by the weight of abandoned basalt. Leventa rose in that same century and wore the mantle of kingship with stern confidence for generations. It gathered jade from the Matagua, iron ore from western hills, and obsidian from volcanoes high above the clouds. It planted columnar basalt like a fence of stone trunks, and buried serpentine mosaics that no commoner would ever see. Yet here also, the ground tells of a planned ending. Sometime around 400 years before the Common Era, fire passed through temples and courtyards. Basalt columns were pulled down, thrones were smashed and reset as offerings. Caches of green stone were interred with deliberate care, as if to return wealth to the earth. In the sacred precinct, the builders laid fresh clay to seal the precinct's heart and then walked away. There is little sign of a foreign army taking the city by storm. Rather, we see a ritual decommissioning, an ending staged by people who still had the strength to bury their gods. When the last processions crossed the great plaza, the man-made mountain still stood above the palm groves. But the voice that had called the marsh to order had chosen silence. Power did not vanish from the lowlands. It changed its shape and shifted its seat west along the Papalopan and south toward the isthmus. Tres Zapotes and Laguna de los Cerros grew as new capitals. Their plazas were lower and more open, their mounds spread in wider clusters along natural rises, their sculpture more varied in style. At Tres Zapotes, the old tradition of colossal heads continued. one of them with heavy eyelids and a helmet strap carved in the old manner. Yet beside these stands stelae that record dates in the long count, a new reckoning that names a day across centuries. One fragment, known as Stela C, preserves an early long count from the last century before the Common Era. Proof that the heirs of the Marsh Kings were finding a different way to anchor power in time. The script that accompanies these dates blooms later along the isthmus at La Mohara and on the Tuxila statuette, a local writing that scholars call Ipialmec, or Isthmian. On those stones, a ruler stands with regalia, heavy as armor, and the text climbs beside him like a ladder of breath, recording deeds and rites in a voice that the swamp had not used before. The old images of cave mouths and Wurjagir children do not disappear, but they share space with a new public language of names and days and conquests. Why did the First Order yield to this second one? The reasons converge like flooded streams on an alluvial plain. Ceremonial platforms and canals demand constant labor to keep their edges sharp against water that wants to soften all things. If a channel wanders, a port of landing dies. If a levee goes untended for a season, the river takes it back. Even in good years, the low country exacts attacks of sweat. Times the rains fail or fall too hard, and the harvest swings from feast to hunger. A court that has promised to regulate water and secure fertility must answer for flood and drought alike. When the promise cannot be kept, rivals stir in neighboring districts, and masked men cut the cords on old thrones. Beyond the marsh, new hilltop powers were rising that drew trade into other paths. To the west, in the Oaxaca highlands, Monty climbed a ridge and laid out terraces and temples along a fortified spine. To the south and east on the Pacific Piedmont and in the Chiapas Depression, Izapa and its neighbors filled their plazas with stelae that echoed lowland forms while naming their own lords. In the far lowlands, of early Maya centers grew around great platforms and causeways that drank labor from the forest. The road of jade and obsidian now had many inns, and La Venta was only one among several grand hosts. There are smaller signs that tell of stress carried in ordinary lives. At La Venta and San Lorenzo, midden layers from the last phases show changes in diet and refuse that suggest households were storing less surplus and eating a broader array of small fish and turtles. In some neighborhoods, rebuilding became thinner and shorter-lived, as if families were less willing to invest in houses that might be abandoned. Monument recarving and relocation became a policy rather than a rare gesture. Old heads were buried face down. Throne-like altars were hacked into new forms and dragged to different courts. Such acts carry both piety and threat, ritually closing one order, while the new order cleans the stage for itself. None of it points to the sort of pitched battle that later histories celebrate. Rather, it reads as faction, usurpation, and the redirected labor of villages whose leaders chose a different center to support. What did these last seasons look like on the ground? In the wet months, canoes still moved along reed-walled channels, and the conical pyramid of La Venta still rose over mist. But more platforms went unplastered. Basalt throne lay on its side while teams chipped at its corners to free a block for a new monument in a new precinct. At San Lorenzo, the elegant drains once kept free for ritual flow, silted and filled with leaf mold and the bones of small animals. Masons pried at the sockets of columnar basalt and packed them onto rafts bound for other towns. In the villages, elders told the old stories of rulers who emerged from caves with a rope in their hand. But younger men wore earspools, incised with newer signs, and spoke of dates and journeys and victories recorded on standing stones. The map of the sacred world was not erased. It was redrawn. By 400 years before the Common Era, La Venta had ceased to be a capital. The long axis was still there. The pyramids still stood, but the courts were quiet. And the voice of the buried offerings was sealed to time. The people did not die out. They farmed the same levees, and fished the same lagoons, and boiled cacao in the same clay cups. They served new courts at Tres Zapotes, Cerro de las Pedras, and other centers along the rivers. They spoke languages that were cousins to the old and learned scripts that their ancestors had not needed. They played the ball game on courts of packed earth and carried rubber balls to shrines as their grandparents had done at El. In the highlands and far forests, other peoples borrowed and changed what the Marsh Kings had made. The Maya would take the grammar of planned centers and long count dates to cosmic heights. The Zapotec would carve rulers and captives on dressed stone and rule from their great hill. The inheritance of the Olmec passed to many hands. What remains now are the signs of both greatness and departure. At San Lorenzo, carved monuments lie in ravines, as if the earth had swallowed a procession. At La Venta, the shattered grand tomb facades early in this Roman age, and then fell quiet. The caravan stations across the Negev still gathered runoff for vines and presses. An amphory of desert wine reached coastal markets by way of Gaza. For a time, the Rose City lived as a proud provincial capital in all but name, prosperous enough to hide the erosion that had begun. The deeper shift came when rivals learned to command the desert in other tongues. Palmyra rose on the Euphrates fringe as a new broker of routes. Its caravans walked the steppe under the protection of treaties with governors and with tribes, and its merchants carved their own accounts on stone in Aramaic and in Greek. In the 3rd century, when the Roman world tottered, Palmyrene princes and then a queen named Zenobia made bold to rule Syria and Egypt and to tax the road that once answered first to Petra. The north drew trade like a magnet, and the southern reaches starved. Petra stayed loyal to Rome and received kind words and municipal improvements, but the caravans thinned, and what cargo did pass was more often counted in Bostra than in the red basin of Wadi Musa. Nature added its own hard verdict. In the year 363, an earthquake struck the highlands of the south. At Petra, walls cracked, columns fell, and the water system suffered the kind of wound that a city in a dry land cannot easily forgive. Channels shifted out of line, plastered cisterns opened, dams slumped, and the terrifying power of sudden flood returned to the sick. When winter storms came down from the Shara, repairs followed, and life continued. Yet the precision that had made the water net an urban miracle was never fully restored. Later, shocks in the 6th and 8th centuries struck the Levant broadly and left the Petra basin with more fractured stone and fewer hands to lift it. Terraces' silted gardens shrank, and houses retreated to the safest ledges and to the quarter around the main spring. The gods changed with the times. Under Rome, the city sanctuaries added marble and new statues, and the divine names of the mountain were written beside Latin dedications. In the Byzantine age, bishops took their seats, and churches rose of cut stone on the ridge above the colonnaded street. A basilica of 3 aisles was paved with mosaics that still shimmer with birds and vines, in a house nearby. A cache of papyri recorded land sales and dowries and tax disputes in a city that had traded incense for olive groves and vineyards. The great rock-cut hall on the western height, which we call the monastery, became a place of Christian rite, its doorway black with lamp smoke. The treasury doorway saw processions of another faith, and then only tourists of later times, who stand to wonder at how many tongues have spoken under its cornice. Religion had not failed, trade had. The early Islamic centuries shifted the map once more. Aqaba on the Gulf reclaimed primacy as a port, and inland routes bent toward Damascus and to the cities of the plain. Petra, off the new lines of march, settled into local life. The Crusaders came and built small castles that crowned sandstone pinnacles. One at Al-Wara, above the sick, and another at Al-Habas, among dark crags. Outworks to watch the Araba and the approach to the spring. Saladin took them and carried the war elsewhere, and the basin returned to farmers and to shepherds, who kept orchards under the cliffs and reused cut stones in garden walls. Travelers passed now and then and spoke of a valley of Moses and a tomb of Aaron on the high mountain. But the old name of Petra sank beneath the memory of saints and springs. By then, the people who had carved facades and set finds into stone were long folded into the populations of Syria and Arabia. Their script, once a flowing Aramaic used to mark tombs and contracts, had passed its curves to the letters that would write Arabic in the Quran. Their methods with water and terrace survived in the craft of upland farmers, who still step slopes into fields and catch winter rains with rubble walls. Their language of power on coin and altar and facade had passed from practice, but remained fixed upon the cliff faces. For any who could read the old shape of a batil, or the Nabatean style of a capital, the final quiet that overtook Petra was not a sack or a burning that ended a people in a day, It was a centuries-long retreat of significance. First, the sea siphoned away the richest cargoes. Then Rome turned the country into a province with a new northern head. Then competitors gathered the steppe under their protection. Then earthquakes cracked the precise machinery of water that had made a city out of cliffs. Last came new roads of commerce and pilgrimage that did not need to pass the Red Basin. The result was absence. Facades weathered, sand drifted, goats grazed where dignitaries once stepped out of litters. The valley lived, but as a village tucked into ruins whose scale no longer matched the life they sheltered. In the 19th century, a traveler with a gift for languages and a habit of disguise walked through the sick to the open court and felt the shock that every visitor feels. When the hidden path gives way to carved stone as broad as a heaven palace, he gave the old name back to the West and set the scholars to work. That rediscovery is a chapter of modern curiosity rather than of ancient fate, yet it closes the circle. Stones do not speak unless someone asks them to, and Petra waited patiently for the question. Tonight, we have walked a long road through time, stood on the rooftops of Cataluque, where life mingled with the bones of ancestors. We traced the measured streets and shining wells of the Indus cities and watched their order loosen like a knot in shifting floodplain. We climbed the courts of Crete and felt the island breathe to the rhythm of ships and ceremony before ash. Ambition and earthquake unstitched its palaces. We heard the treaties and chariot wheels of Hattusa and saw how drought, raiders, and broken roads turned a great archive to silence. We moved through the warm green breath of the Gulf lands, where earth became pyramid and throne, and offerings slept beneath the clay, and we watched the old order pass its torch along new rivers. We entered Petra by the narrow gorge and found a kingdom that made water a covenant and stone a scripture, then faded as sea roots and empire rewrote the map. 6 vanished worlds, each with its own genius, and in each, the same lesson beneath a different sky. Cities are promises. Water is power. Trade is a vein that can be cut. Law can bind an age and then become a relic in a museum case. Stones endure where voices fail. The ground remembers in plaster that still bears a palm print, in a drainstone set perfectly level, in a treaty baked hard by a palace fire, in a jade bead that slides cool as river water across the skin, in Nabatean letters that curve toward the script of a later faith. Archaeology is a long conversation with stubborn things. Ask and ask again. The answers come in fragments that must be placed with patience. When we look back across these ruins, we do not see ghosts in the simple sense. We see decisions, thousands upon thousands, about harvest and worship, about roads and neighbors, about who leads and who follows. Those choices raised courts and markets, and they also cut the first small cracks that time and chance widened. The past is not a single fall from a high wall. It is a loosened thread that finally gives. Wherever you are, may the night be kind. Let the images settle like dust after a long procession. The white rooftops on the Anatolian plain, the cool steps down into the great bath, lilies painted in a sea wind, lions carved at a gate of stone, a green mask sleeping under clay, a red cliff that opens like a book. Close your eyes and listen for the quiet that follows the crowd. In that quiet, history is still speaking. Thank you for traveling with me. Until we meet again, rest well.